Rachel, I never knew you were a doctor.
Oh, I'm a doctor, not a medical one, but the
Yeah.
other kind.
So is one of you gonna start the meeting?
Yeah. Yeah. We're just gonna give it another couple of minutes and then
Okay, Jane Goldenberg had asked Tom if she could make an announcement about the city hall hearing next week on plastics, and I see she's on, so could you give her a couple minutes to do that?
sure, go ahead,
Of
Jane.
course.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm a little tiny bit late. So the there is a joint hearing on the single-use plastic problem, and I sent out an email today to the Chicago members. And if you didn't get it, because I know there was an issue about someone reporting they didn't get it, drop your email in the chat and I can make sure you have it. It's next Wednesday. It's a joint hearing sponsored by the Health and Human Relations and Environmental Protection and Energy Committees, April 23rd, 12 to 2 at City Hall, 121 North LaSalle, second floor. And we really need to show the council members what a serious problem this is. It might be difficult to get anybody to take it seriously unless we show strong support in the community, because obviously, as everybody knows, our country is in a weird moment and people are afraid of economic calamity. So I'm not sure they're going to need convincing. Um, and in the email that was sent out today, we let you know how to make a written comment, how to register to attend, or make a public comment, and there's resources in there. So let me know if you didn't get it and you want to do something, which we need you to do, and I will make sure you see the email. Any questions or
That's great. Thanks for sharing that,
oh,
Jane.
good. Thanks, Rachel.
Okay, so
So,
we'll get started. Tonight we're looking at two aspects of pulling money away from fossil fuel companies. Rachel's going to start with a talking about what you can do as a personal level, and that'll take up the greater part of the meeting. And then after Rachel is done, and we have time for Q&A and perhaps breakout rooms, if I can figure out how to make that work. We'll have a discussion that I'll lead briefly on a fossil fuel divestment bill that has been introduced in the state legislature. So, Rachel, why don't you go ahead?
okay, great. Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everybody. My name's Rachel Fredericks. My pronouns are she or they, and I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I'm a volunteer team leader for the Chicago Climate Action and Policy team, which focuses on building decarbonization. But tonight I'll be talking about climate-friendly personal banking and investment. So the idea is using whatever savings and investments we might have to shift power from fossil fuel companies to climate solutions, because that's a key strategy that I've been learning about and implementing in my own life slowly but surely for decades now. So here's an agenda that we can use to guide us. We'll start with some background about the role of the financial industry in perpetuating and exacerbating the climate crisis, but also its potential to support mitigation and adaptation. So everyone here probably knows that fossil fuels are the number one cause of climate chaos, and it's probably no surprise that it takes lots of money to find and extract and process and distribute and burn all those dirty fossil fuels. But what not everybody realizes is just how much money is poured into the fossil infrastructure that our society runs on. So, for instance, in 2022, the IMF estimated that the cost of US public fossil fuel subsidies was $757 billion with a B. That's for 1 year. $757 billion of public money collected from taxpayers and used in various ways to subsidize fossil fuels. Ouch. For that amount of money, you could install 30.28 million residential solar arrays like the one on my parents' roof in Iowa, and that would generate an additional 363 billion kilowatt hours per year. But that money is just one drop in a very big bucket. In 2023, banks provided another 705 billion with a B dollars of fossil fuel financing on top of government subsidies. That would be enough to buy 1.4 million electric buses at $500,000 each. In addition, the fossil fuel industry gets billions upon billions of dollars from private equity and from other sources as well. It's really a mind-boggling amount of money. But suppose all that money from the government, from banks, from investors, suppose it just wasn't available to fossil fuel companies. Imagine if all that money was instead redirected toward climate solutions, stuff like solar and wind power, public transit, electric vehicles, regenerative agriculture, geothermal heat pumps, batteries, blah, blah, blah. We have plenty of proven methods and technologies for reducing emissions, but it takes money to implement what we know works. So this graph from the Climate Policy Initiative shows on the left in dark green, the less than $2 trillion annually spent up through 2021 for climate financing. Then in tan on the right, we see estimates that put our needs for climate financing between $8 and $10 trillion every year. Again, those needs for climate financing are pretty overwhelming. Climate financing means financing of solutions here. Okay, so there's a giant need. You might think philanthropy would cover that, but no, even after increasing somewhat, climate funding from philanthropy was still just less than 2% of global philanthropic giving in 2020. So climate change is only getting a tiny, tiny sliver of the money from folks who can afford to donate to charitable causes. The good news is that we here and millions of others globally, each individually and collectively, have some control over where some money is directed. Collectively, we can have a really big influence on which future we're saving for and investing in. So even if you can't afford a single penny or a single penny more to charity, your choice about where to store your money until you use it can also have a big impact. So even if you can't give money, the money that you're keeping can be banked or invested in more or less climate-friendly ways. Let's think through why. Banks and credit unions are able to make money and provide services because they loan the money that people deposit there, and then they charge interest on those loans. Some of those institutions loan money to fossil fuel companies, but others do not. Similarly, if you invest in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, or any other investments, you can choose whether you want to finance fossil fuels as part of that or not. You can choose to invest in climate solutions or not. And this is a really good time to clarify the difference between investment and divestment. So when a person or institution divests from something, it means they're taking money away from some person, company, institution, or project that they judge to be somehow bad. So if I'm divesting from fossil fuels, it means I'm looking at all the money I have saved and invested. And when I identify any of that money that is or might be supporting fossil fuel extraction and profiteering, I shift that money into some other investment. In the land of mutual funds, they talk about negative screens to describe this. So a mutual fund might screen for, say, fossil fuels or private prisons or tobacco, and exclude any companies in those businesses from the fund. On the flip side, an investment proactively puts money or other resources into a company or a project that's judged to be good. So, for example, I'm invested in one mutual fund that employs what are called positive screens. Rather than starting with a set of possible companies and taking out the bad guys, a positive screen starts from zero and only includes companies working on solutions, solar panel companies, battery storage developers, heat pump manufacturers, electric bus makers, or whatever the case may be. Investment is just as important as divestment, but it doesn't always get as much attention and press. Because investment is a vote of confidence in something, it's just as important to invest in climate solutions as it is to divest from fossil fuels. And the more people who choose to finance climate solutions and divest from fossil fuels, the bigger our collective impact on the future we want. So whether you have 20 bucks in a savings account, $2,000 in a checking account, 20,000 in a brokerage account, 200,000 in a retirement account, or whatever, you can choose whether your savings and investments are financing dirty fossil fuels or a stable climate and a clean energy future. Of course, for many people, thinking about money can be a source of stress and anxiety and confusion. That's always been true, and it's especially true in these crazy times. But it doesn't have to be as stressful as sometimes it is. I'm a big supporter of generally trying to be more open to talking about money as a way of normalizing that kind of talk, making it less scary, and in the long term, supporting better decision making. So let's transition to the more practical sort of how-to part. We'll start with the simplest, safest, and most accessible kinds of accounts, and we'll work our way toward the ones that allow for greater risks and rewards, which also generally require more money. That is, we'll start with savings banks and credit unions, and then consider some crowdfunding opportunities, and then look at other investments, traditional things like stocks, bonds, mutual funds, so on. So, savings banks and credit unions are generally the most familiar, safest, most accessible institutions for saving money. If you aren't familiar with credit unions, they're like banks, but they're owned by the people who bank there, who are members of the credit union rather than customers. It's not a separate people outside who get the profits. So credit unions often are able to offer better interest rates and better customer service, though not always, right? So you can open savings accounts and checking accounts at a bank or a credit union, and you can generally get a range of other services there as well. So you might open a money market account for a slightly higher interest rate. You might purchase CDs, get a mortgage, some other kind of loan. If you don't have much money, banks and credit unions offer your best opportunity to save because minimum deposits can be as low as $5 at many credit unions, and because deposits are federally insured up to $250,000 by the FDIC or the NCUA, which is the credit union version. Since 1933, when the FDIC was created, no depositor has lost the money they put into a federally insured account. I mean, they've spent it on silly things, but they haven't lost because of a bank failure or something like that. But the big banks that people tend to be most familiar with are generally the worst offenders in terms of fossil fuel financing. You may already know that JP Morgan Chase is the worst of the worst in this respect, but there are plenty of others that aren't far behind. Here you can see the dirty dozen worst in terms of post-Paris Climate Agreement fossil fuel financing. So how do you find a bank or a credit union to provide the services that you need that isn't funding climate chaos? Well, you can visit a site like bank.green, which I've screenshotted here, and you can check out the details of your current bank, see how they're doing. Or you can go straight to this tool they have that lets you search for sustainable banks using various filters, depending on the criteria that matter most to you. For instance, it might be important to you that there's a physical branch location that's near your house. Or you might prefer a fully online banking experience. There's options for everybody. Another site you can check out is getabetterbank.org, which has its own tool for helping you find a bank or credit union that meets your needs. It also has a really great step-by-step explanation of how to switch banks with a minimum of fuss and confusion, because it does take some planning and a little bit of time to execute a shift of your money from one bank to another. But if you break it down into one step at a time and don't rush, the process can be manageable. Which brings us to the benefits. Let's say you have $200 that you're saving for an emergency, a rainy day, or whatever. You want to earn some interest on that $200, but you don't want the risk of putting it in the stock market. You could put it in a big bank, and who knows what kind of project they would fund using your money. Or you could put it into, say, the Clean Energy Credit Union, which only finances climate solutions. Their loans finance solar panel installations, geothermal heat pumps, home weatherproofing, and electric vehicles, including electric bikes. I chose Clean Energy Credit Union for this example because they have this really neat online tool that estimates the benefits of whatever amount of money you choose to deposit with them. So keeping your $200 with them instead of, say, Chase Bank is equivalent to reducing your annual carbon emissions by 87 pounds individually. Or if you want a different kind of number, it's like driving 96 fewer miles, or charging over 4,800 cell phones, or growing a tree seedling for 10 years. You can use this tool to estimate what impact you could have given your bank balance. Of course, keeping greater savings on deposit or having more different people making deposits makes for a greater impact overall. And speaking of more people, here I'll put in a suggestion. If you know a kid or a teenager who doesn't yet have a bank or credit union account, or maybe they have one, but there's not very much in it, please consider helping that young person open or switch to a sustainable account. While shifting your money is worth it, in my opinion, no matter who you are, it's easier to make the shift when you're young and your banking needs are relatively simple compared to when you're older and you've got a whole bunch of different linked accounts and more complex financial needs. It's easier in general if you set things up in a sustainable way from the start of your journey. So whether you've got kids, grandkids, nephews, nieces, or any other kids in your life, I'd encourage you to help them get off on a good foot as early as possible. I'm immensely grateful that my parents gave me a really good financial education early, and I'd be happy to help you if you want to give that sort of gift to a youngster in your life. Um, Shifting back, though, to the adult or at least young adult crowd, the next place you might consider putting some of your money is in a crowdfunding platform. So, like a Kickstarter or GoFundMe, but for climate investments. The one that I happen to know about used to be called Raise Green and recently merged with a platform called Honeycomb Credit, which now offers both the climate investments that I'm familiar with, but also other opportunities to invest in small businesses in local communities around the country. So here we're talking about businesses run by women, people of color, LGBTQIA folks, and others who have traditionally had a harder time accessing business loans. On a platform like this, the minimum investment there is $100. So that does put it out of reach for some people, but for lots of people, including plenty of young folks, they can swing $100. So investing in this type of platform, unlike a standard savings account that's federally insured, does carry some risk. You, you could lose the money you invested if the business fails. But on the flip side, these investments generally provide a higher return, a higher interest rate than what you would get from even a high yield savings account or a CD, depending on the terms at the moment. And some of the projects are really great. You can invest in projects like EV charging infrastructure, green bonds, a textile recycling company, or energy efficiency upgrades for commercial buildings, just to name a few that I've seen on that site. Each investment on a platform like this is rather different, but this type of platform can be a kind of fun way to learn about and support very specific projects. You'll know exactly which company you're investing in and exactly what they're going to do with the money. That can be a little fun. Finally, is what I'm calling other investments. For most people, this means mutual funds that are purchased through a brokerage account or maybe a health savings account or an individual retirement account like a Roth IRA or a 401k or a 403b or whatever. Those different kinds of accounts, if you're not familiar, they're like different kinds of baskets that you can put your purchases in. So you might buy the same fund as your neighbor, but put it in a different kind of account, or you might have multiple funds in one account, and they're treated differently for tax purposes. You might also pick individual stocks or bonds or exchange traded funds, but I personally don't do that or recommend it for whatever it's worth. But all these investments do carry some risk of losing your money, but again, they also offer a greater potential return. Exactly what the risk and reward potential is depends on the type of fund and the specific fund that you choose. But the range of options in this category is truly, truly immense. For these investments, you often need a minimum investment of $1,000, sometimes a little more or less, or you might need to be enrolled in an employer-sponsored retirement plan as an institutional. If you're in a position to invest in mutual funds, I've put some key questions here for you to consider. When you're buying mutual funds, you buy them from fund families, which are basically brands. So just like you can buy cookies and frozen dinners made by Kraft or Annie's, you can buy mutual funds from different brands or families. Some families are huge, like Fidelity or Vanguard or BlackRock, which you may have heard of. They give you lots of options. But other mutual fund families are more specialized and they focus solely on what's sometimes called ESG or impact investing. It goes by a lot of different names, but these are investments that positively and or negatively screen for environmental, social, governance, or other factors besides just the bottom line. Some of these may or may not actively pressure companies to do better on sustainability metrics through things like shareholder proposals to corporate boards of directors. For instance, mutual fund families like Domini, Calvert, and Parnassus specialize entirely in ESG type funds. They're experts who are committed across the board in all the products they offer, not just treating ESG as some sort of a side project. So you might prefer to go with one of the big fund families, or you might prefer to go with the ESG only type fund families for one reason or another, but either way, you've got choices. Other things to make choices about include whether to prioritize investment or divestment, the specific things that you want to invest in or divest from, your risk tolerance, the fees involved in the different investments you're considering. These are all things that you could talk over with a professional financial advisor if you like, or talk them over with your friends or family or someone like me who will not offer financial advice, but someone who's just comfortable talking about these things and doing research to try to help folks think through their own priorities. In my experience, and I know for a fact I'm not alone in this, quite a few professional financial advisors are pretty laser focused on mainstream trends for maximizing profit, and they aren't necessarily as knowledgeable or supportive about ESG investing as one might hope. But I'm sure there are good ones out there. And to be clear, I don't think that most people need a professional financial advisor, as long as they're open to doing a little homework and exercising some patience and common sense. One tool that I use a lot is freely available at fossilfreefunds.org. You can use this tool to look up specific funds that you already have in your portfolio to see if they align with whatever your values may be. Or you can set up filters to find funds that you might like to invest in that you'd feel comfortable getting behind. At this site, you can also use other filters to screen for things like, besides fossil fuels, you can also screen for things like gender equity, deforestation, private prisons, weapons, tobacco. There's a lot of categories. So here, what I've done is I've selected 4 funds that score pretty well on various ESG metrics. And you can do a direct comparison on, say, fossil insurance here. But you can also, on the same screen, you can compare them on financial metrics, like the type of fund that they are and the net assets in the fund and the expense ratio and the annualized returns and all that kind of stuff. At Fossil Free Funds, you can also look up particular fund families. They don't have all of them, but they have many of the large ones that you can look at a summary about them. And you can even look at the retirement plans of certain large companies. Google's just one example of a company whose retirement fund they've analyzed. There's a lot more on this website as well. But once you've identified a cleaner institution or investment that you feel good about, here's another tip about how to comfortably manage your financial shift. Even if you leave the money that you already have where it is, putting new earnings into a new climate-friendly account or investment is one way to make progress. If you open a new account, start putting new earnings in that, over time, your balance of assets automatically shifts towards more cleaner stuff. That's a path I've been taking. Over time, I've opened up some new and better accounts as I've found better opportunities, and I've chosen cleaner investments within my accounts. And then when I have to withdraw money, I withdraw from the dirtiest accounts and investments first, which then I'm able to close over time. That might not maximize my climate impact immediately, like instantaneously, but it's a strategy that allows me to continually increase my impact without being overwhelmed or taking a risk I'm not comfortable with. Now, you might be asking, hey, if I do this climate-friendly invest divest stuff, am I going to have to settle for smaller returns? Am I going to have to sacrifice profit? Am I going to have to work longer before I retire? No. Thank goodness the answer is clearly no. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's start by comparing the fossil fuel industry to the S&P 500, which is an index that tracks the 500 largest publicly traded companies in the US. As shown here, for the last decade, the yellow line represents the fossil fuel companies, and that's been performing way below the black line for the rest of the market. Those fossil fuel companies just aren't making as much money as all the other stuff. Another way to look at it is if you take the entire S&P 500 and just negatively screen out the whole energy sector, which is dragged down by those dirty fossil fuels, you get the blue line, which is the highest line here. So if you had pursued a run-of-the-mill fossil fuel divestment strategy where you just buy a bit of everything in an index fund that excludes fossil fuels, over the past decade, you would have made more money than people who bought an index fund that included the fossil fuels. And you would have made a lot more money than the folks who just buy fossil fuels. And there are some of those out there. Of course, past performance is no guarantee of future returns. There's always risk in playing the market. But those fossil fuel companies will be in even bigger trouble eventually, one way or the other. Stranded assets, changing regulatory environment. One way or another, I, for one, am not risking my money on fossil fuel companies. To drive the point home, we can present similar findings in a different way. Here are some quotes from a 2021 Carbon Tracker report. They also looked at a 10-year period, but they were looking globally, not just at US markets. And they found that the energy sector, where the fossil fuel stocks are, actually lost 2.4% of investors' money, while the global market as a whole increased by 11.7%. And renewables and other clean tech earned an even greater 14.3% over that decade. So renewables outperformed the market as a whole globally, and they way outperformed the rest of the energy sector, that is, the fossil fuels. If you're worried that those two studies are weird outliers, here's just a sampling of the many peer-reviewed academic articles in various specialist journals, all of which conclude that the kind of fossil fuel divestment and climate solution investment strategies under discussion, they've led to equal or greater financial performance across various timeframes in the US and abroad, and given different portfolio risk tolerances. But do these strategies actually make a difference? Yes. Though here things get a bit more complicated because the whole invest, divest movement has more than one goal. One thing the movement is trying to do is to educate people about climate change and its enablers and profiteers. The movement also seeks to revoke the social license to extract, process, distribute, and sell fossil fuels. That is, we want to ruin some reputations. It's hard to measure success on those first two things in a super precise way, but we're seeing increasing engagement with divestment protests and increasing numbers of institutions making divestment commitments. So it's clear that the movement is growing, and that's one kind of evidence of success on those first two measures. What about pain points for the fossil fuel companies? That third goal of actually starving the fossil fuel companies of the resources they need to do business. There's some good news there, though it's more modest so far. Here's a selection of peer-reviewed academic journal articles, all of which find evidence that divestment announcements from large institutional investors do have a negative impact on fossil fuel share prices or fossil fuel companies' ability to access additional capital. Evidence quantifying emissions reductions attributable to divestment campaigns is limited, but that's because proving attributability of any kind is difficult. Okay. So we know that climate-friendly banking and investment can make you money, can make your life more meaningful by aligning your activities with your deeply held values, and can help advance the climate movement. Suppose you've already done some of what I've recommended here. What if you get stuck and you hit a wall? It can happen. Here's one way it can happen. For many years, I was a college professor at a state university in Indiana. Through my employer, I had a retirement plan, but like many universities, they didn't allow employees to invest in just anything. You had to select from a menu of pre-vetted options. But there were no low carbon options on the menu. There were no fossil-free funds. And to be honest, that pissed me off. And so I was able to organize a little mini campaign with a tiny bit of support from each of a few dozen colleagues. And I got the policy changed so that there is at least one fossil-free investment option to choose from for the thousands of employees at that university. That's a story I could tell in detail another day in another venue or answer questions about during Q&A. Basically, once you've ensured that your assets are aligned with your values, or you've done as much as you're able to at the moment, what's next? You could just pat yourself on the back and move on. It would be cool. But at that point, you've probably learned a fair bit, and you can keep your eyes peeled for opportunities to share all that knowledge and help others learn from your successes and setbacks. At that point, you're probably ready to help others get whatever benefits you've gotten financially or otherwise. So you'd be well positioned to join a collective effort to divest an institution in your life, whether it's a house of worship, school, workplace, state pension fund, whatever. The divestment movement really needs people of all kinds working together creatively and relentlessly. So at this point, I'm about ready to hand things over to Jeff Green, who's going to talk more about divestment at the collective level. But first, I just want to give you one more hot tip. As I mentioned, it may feel like too much to try to shift all your money at once. I get it. The good news is that you don't have to do it all at once. And there are certain key moments that you can take advantage of to make things easier. For instance, if you're moving to a new city and you need a new bank anyway, that's a perfect opportunity to start off on the right foot. Or if you get a new job with a retirement account, you can set it up with climate-friendly investments from the start. Those are good pivot moments to start new habits, and they're the sort of thing that you can prepare for in advance by doing some research right now, so that if any one of those situations does arise, you've done your research and you're ready to go when the moment is right. Okay, now I'm going to pass the mic to Jeff Green, who leads our Divest, Desponsor, and Defund team. Jeff's got tons of bold ideas and initiatives, so I just can't wait to hear what he has to share. I'll stop sharing for now.
And I'm not going to talk about some of those bold ideas. I'm going to talk about one thing, which is the fossil fuel divestment bill. But first, Rachel, should we see if people have questions about your presentation first? Mine's going to be fairly brief, and yours
Okay.
is really geared towards personal investing, individual pocketbooks. So perhaps we could look at those first, and then I'll run through my slides.
Okay, great.
And I apologize for the breakout rooms. I looked it up. It looks like it should be real simple, but
We can skip it. We're a small enough group that I think it'll be just fine as a whole
I
group.
agree.
Susan, why don't you ask your question first, if you please?
Yeah, you said that there were all these that the fossil fuels are supported by our government to the tune of 200 billion or something like that. And what I was
Way
curious
more.
about is where is that money from tax deductions or where does that money come from exactly?
Part of
Kind
why
of.
it's hard to estimate this amount and why I'm relying on the IMF estimates is because this money comes from a million different places. So it's tax breaks that the fossil fuel companies get. It's state and local investment in particular projects in particular communities. It's sometimes direct subsidies. It's regulations that prop up the industry. It's allowing the fossil fuel companies to not pay the social cost. So, for instance, like healthcare costs are higher than they would be in a world where we weren't burning fossil fuels, right? But fossil fuel companies don't pay for my asthma medication. So there's like so many different ways in which public money gets funneled into the fossil fuel companies, or sometimes it's not funneled directly into them, but they get to avoid paying certain costs that we could have made them pay. And that's why these estimates are estimates. It's coming from so many places that no one knows an exact dollar amount.
And
I went with the IMF. Yeah.
so you got it from the IMF, basically?
Mhm. Yeah.
If I was going to try looking it up, could you give me a little more than just
Yeah.
IMF?
So actually, if you share your email in the chat, we can share my slides out to everybody, and there's links in the slides to where I'm finding specific citations. And I'll just put my email in the chat right now. If you end up having any trouble, I'm happy to help you track down citations and stuff like that.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Elliot, I'd be happy to field your question.
Thanks, Rachel. Appreciate your presentation, and I've seen a number of these, and they're always helpful. A couple of thoughts that I had. You mentioned if you're young, the issues and concerns are very different than if you're an elder, and I see that we have a few more elder people here who may be retired and trying to think about how they moved a legacy of Chase accounts and Schwab accounts into things. And I found that using Schwab or Fidelity for finding funds that are socially responsible is very difficult. And so this opportunity for these green groups to do that, even if you're looking at a Calvert, some of the responsible funds still are investing in banks, even if they pulled out fossil fuels. So if you're trying to get out of the dirty banks, that's not easy to do. And the only way to do that is if you have enough money they will do something for you if you have enough money to actually have them mirror the Calvert fund you want and pull out stuff and put in other stuff. So that's kind of the divest or invest. But any suggestions? My frustration is, I have Chase, savings, lots of credit card stuff. We used to have a mortgage. And one of the things I've had trouble finding is banks or credit unions that can mirror what I have in one place, so I don't have to kind of be piecemeal. So maybe you could see if there's any great suggestions on that.
Okay, that's an awesome question. I also totally want to just validate what you said about how difficult it can be with some of the big guys to find good investments. And I will say that I've not found any that on my metrics are perfect. And that's why I view this as a work in progress. We can always be thinking about like, oh, what would be like slightly better? And I do encourage people to have that work in progress kind of idea. Like if you go to fossil free funds, there is no fund that gets straight A's
Right.
across the board.
Right.
We're not there yet. So that's what I'd say about that. This question about finding one place that has everything you need, I sympathize with you. Every person's banking needs are somewhat different. So I don't have the answer that's going to be the answer for everyone. In fact, I don't even have the answer that's perfect for me because I have had to spread my accounts over a couple different institutions to try to get all the services that I want. But I have made a lot of progress. I would encourage folks to start with something that you're comfortable with. If it's just like a plain regular savings account, start there. And sort of do one at a time. In my experience, the hardest thing to get sorted out is the credit cards, because the way the credit card infrastructure works, almost everything is ultimately owned by one of the big guys, even if you get it through a little guy credit union or something like that. There's some partnership in the background. Because that's the case, I give myself permission to not be perfect. I do need to have a credit card to live my life as I currently understand it. And so I give myself permission to not be perfect and just keep my eyes out for a better opportunity with credit cards. But pretty much everything other than a credit card, I've managed to find a solution for myself. And it means having more than one account, and I keep track of them in a spreadsheet. So that's the closest I've come. But you're totally right, Elliot. Yeah.
It's nice to understand that other people are feeling the same kind of pains going through this process.
I can validate you 100%.
Yeah.
We're in this together. Yeah.
I also have had a similar experience, Elliot, because I'm at Chase. I moved all of my retirement, all my investments into funds that are, at least on the surface, out of fossil fuels completely. I think, your point about maybe they're in banks or something else is well taken. And it is hard to be on the side of the angels, as Rachel was pointing out. Another thing that happens and that people need to be aware of is that when you do the right thing and you move investments into these funds that are ostensibly fossil free, you may be sad when you get your tax bill, as I was in 23 when I moved things over. But that might be mean that, as Rachel said, you need to do these things slowly, and just bite the bullet a little bit at a time. But yeah, there are certain downsides, and I think what you tell yourself is, as Rachel pointed out, when you get out of fossil fuels, you're doing in the long run much better as an investment vehicle in terms of return on investment and lack of volatility. So yeah, I feel you, Elliot.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely everybody's situation is different. The tax consequences could be significant in some cases. That's one reason to try to spread it out. And yeah, again, like, give yourself that permission, depending on where you're at. Yeah, John, you have a question?
Well, I had two, and they're both kind of touched on already, but I will just give you my take on both. The indirect cost that Susan was referring to, and you mentioned from the IMF fund, I think it would be good to have a slide, backup slide to your presentation when you have that 754, which is the big number, at least have buckets that build up to the 754. So how much of it is implied costs we're not charging them versus tax deductions versus, IMF has some, I would think if you drill into that report, you can find those buckets. So
Yeah.
it's because in other words, that at least gives, because if I'm arguing for that, I'd like to say, here's where they've come from, and as opposed to just the direct, because the direct's a relatively small number in that 757 was like 3, I think you had. Yeah,
Yeah.
3.
So the explicit subsidies are 3 billion. That's still a lot of money. That's still so many electric buses and so many solar arrays and so many bike paths and so many heat pumps. That 3 billion is still a lot of money. But you're right that the majority of this public money that goes towards fossil fuels is these implicit subsidies, the negative externalities. These can be kind of invisible in some ways, they're estimates, but we are in fact paying those costs. We're
I
not
think it'd
paying
be
them
helpful
directly to
pull that
investors.
number out, to pull that number out. Just saying, as you present this again, because that draws your eye right away, but yet the explanation is a broad generality, but yet their methodology had to pull those numbers from in some fashion. That's all.
Yeah, unfortunately, that what I found didn't break it down beyond this, implicit and explicit. So I might have to dig a little deeper to find a further breakdown within those implicit subsidies. Yeah.
So
Thanks,
I mean,
John.
At a
that's just
high level, it costs
comment.
a lot of money to destroy a planet. I think basically that's what we're getting at.
Yeah. And then the other thing was, I'm running that same scenario with my retirement accounts. I mean, I've had Wells Fargo advisors for 25 years, and I have a financial guy that I like, and I'm not going to believe him, but I've given him some direction already. Very specifically, he had some pipeline stuff that I knew was bad, and I said, as that matures, get out over time. Whenever you get out when you can. But now I'm going to take a look at that fossilfreefund.org and just play with, say, okay, what are some of the possibilities? And then I will go back to him and say, okay, what about this or this? Or can you take an index fund, X fossil fuel, X out, and just shift me into that? Because that's not going to be a massive movement. And then I don't run into tax bill risk at this stage because they're all in retirement accounts. They're moving within there. So you don't have to worry about that tax consequence. So therefore, us in the retirement mode can shift these things. Maybe hard, but you're not going to run into that, oh boy, I've got to liquidate, get a capital gain or whatever, and then shift into something else because you're still in the IRA umbrella. So that's kind of my approach going forward. But that's something where you don't run into an immediate tax problem by moving.
Yeah, thanks for being explicit about that, John. I also want to say, highlight another thing in your comment, which is if you have a relationship with some kind of financial advisor or professional, making it clear that these are your priorities, that you want cleaner investments. It's not going to change the world just doing that, but the more of us that do that, the more financial advisors know this is something people care about. It's an opportunity for our company to retain customers. It's an opportunity for us to increase business, like money talks. If you make it clear that that's what you want, that's all to the good.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. Bruce, go ahead.
Thank you.
Oh, I was just going to make a comment that I have family members and they sometimes have brokerage accounts and they have savings. And when I ask them to basically divest and invest in green, they can be intimidated by their financial analysts. And so people just are uncomfortable being direct with their financial analysts because, when they first talk to them, the analyst might think that, they're condescending, like, you don't understand the market. Let me take care of you and let me make all the decisions. And you, I had to really pump up one of my family members to be very direct. And at the point that the financial analyst realizes that, this person is going to take their money somewhere else, they responded. But, people have to just get over that a feeling of being intimidated. That's the only
Yeah,
comment I wanted to make.
Yeah, I think you're right that the intimidation factor is huge for a lot of people, and they're not crazy to feel that way. It's a complex world. There's a lot riding on it for us and our futures. So I would never say like that those feelings are misplaced. It's reasonable, and it's reasonable given the financial education and experience that many people have. And so for folks who do have experience that's relevant, and are loved ones, maybe not professional financial advisors, again, talking about it can help normalize it. It can help people get comfortable. I had colleagues at my previous institution ask me like some really basic questions about investing, and they were so grateful to have just a normal person who was a peer who was comfortable answering basic questions about what's the difference between a this and a that. Um, and that made a big difference in their lives. They didn't feel scared or that, I was going to make any money off of what they were saying. So I had no incentive to, um, trick them or anything like that. So if you can play that role for someone, whether it's a family member or a colleague, that can be a game changer for folks.
Okay,
I
well,
think in the interest of time, let's pass it over to Jeff.
yeah. So I'm going to do like I say, a fairly quick presentation, and then maybe we can just do a Q&A in whatever time's left for either Rachel or myself. So I'm going to look at a particular bill. Let me share this. Okay, you can all see my slide here? Yes? Okay, so there's a bill that's been introduced in the Illinois House and Senate, the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act, and it is aimed at getting the state to divest pension funds, certain state pension funds from the fossil fuel companies. You know, just a few quick facts that I think Rachel has covered too. Burning fossil fuels accounts for 75% of total global emissions, #1 contributor to global warming. Pension funds control $55.7 trillion in global assets and have disproportionately heavy fossil fuel exposure. They might hold nearly 30% of all fossil fuel stocks. So Illinois has an opportunity as one of the leading blue states to slow the flow of capital to the fossil fuel industry and divest some of its pension funds from fossil fuels. So that will be decarbonizing our pension funds. And in particular in Illinois, it really brings us into alignment with the commitments of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, CEJA, which is looking to go to a carbon zero economy in the state over the next couple of decades. So here's the major points of the bill, and the bill numbers are SB 0130 in the Senate, HB 3961 in the House. So we're asking for the state to stop new fund investing in fossil fuel companies immediately. The same funds will require them to divest public holdings, which are basically your stocks and bonds, in oil, coal, and natural gas companies over a period of 5 years, and 10 years for private investments. These are things like private equity, which are perhaps contractually obligated to stay in for a certain number of years, but in almost all cases, 10 or fewer. Requires each pension fund to report its holdings in the public and private markets in terms of fossil fuel investments. And then finally, requires each pension fund to disclose any analytic methods they've used in determining climate-related financial risks posed by its fossil fuel investments, okay, and the results of the analysis. So the methods and the results. So here are the main pension funds that we're looking at with these: state employees, General Assembly, judicial retirement, teachers' retirement, and state university retirements. There are other pension funds, but these are directly administered by the state, and therefore the state has the most control over these types of investments. So it's not just the fact, as I mentioned before, that they're destroying the planet. Aside from that, they're a less desirable investment, and there is more and more competition from alternative sources. There's, in best case scenarios, increasing regulation, and there are certainly a lot of legal challenges. So many legal challenges that I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but the fossil fuel companies are talking to their friends in Congress and trying to get an escape clause, basically, from the suits that are in progress, similar to what the firearms industry was able to get. So they're worried about the state suits. There are over 30 of them in progress right now, including one from Chicago. So divestment is an opportunity to get away from the possible effects of all these lawsuits, regulations, et cetera, that are facing the fossil fuel industry. So it's a way of reducing the risk to Illinois and its future. So here's something you may have remembered from Rachel's presentation. Okay, this shows the energy sector down here. The S&P 500 without fossil fuels is the top line. And you can see how adding the fossil fuel sector in brings the S&P 500 down. So it's just not a good choice. Here's another table that just shows you that over 10 years, ending in 24, the energy sector had the lowest ROI, total rate of return, and also the highest volatility. So if you're looking at a pension fund, high volatility is something that you don't want in your fund because these are ostensibly long-term investments for your pensioners that you want to be stable. There are multiple studies, and I think Rachel mentioned these too, that indicate that divesting from fossil fuels has either no effect or a positive effect on the returns of the funds. There are more studies than this. There's also a movement among some in the investment community to talk about, well, we shouldn't really divest because we want to keep a seat at the table. We want to be able to engage as shareholders with these fossil fuel companies. The thing to remember is none of these shareholder engagements have worked. In one case with Exxon, they sued shareholders that wanted faster climate action, even after the shareholder group dropped their effort to get them to move faster on climate action. Exxon did not drop the suit. In some cases, some of these fossil fuel companies will change some of their business practices, but shareholder engagement, in theory, is asking these companies to change their entire business model. And they're just not doing that. They're not going to do that. And they have more or less retrenched and worked to increase their extraction. So again, looking at what Rachel's done, over 1,600 organizations with over $40 trillion in assets have committed to divest. In Illinois, there are groups that have divested. New York City is committed to divest. Pension fund divestiture was adopted by the state of Oregon. So we're certainly not alone. We're among a growing group of organizations, entities that are looking to divest. Here's a list of our sponsors and co-sponsors so far in the House and the Senate. Will Guzzardi is the introducing sponsor in the House, and Adrian Johnson in the Senate. So it's an important step in slowing fossil fuel expansion. It puts Illinois in a growing group of localities that are part of this movement. It's safe and responsible. Other alternatives like shareholder engagement have failed. And it's really the way to go. If you're interested, you can go to climatesafepensionsillinois.org. That's our website. You'll find all kinds of materials there about this. And just to wrap up, and we can do some more questions. Tuesday, our group, Climate Safe Pensions Illinois, which is a coalition of 350 Chicago, Climate Reality, and Third Act Illinois, we met in the offices of Senator Robert Martwick, who is the chair of the Senate Pension Committee, with representatives from some of the pension funds. And it was I got to say, it was a delightfully nerdy confrontation. We got into some details of the models that they use, and significantly, there wasn't one representative at the table that said that they weren't in agreement with our goals of divesting and getting out of fossil fuels and recognizing the dangers of fossil fuels. But they presented this model that they use for forecasting the shortfall in the pension funds that the state is required to make up. And they said basically, if we get rid of fossil fuels, it reduces the diversity of the funds. And the model says that our long-term return on investment drops from 7% to 6.5%, which will mean that the state needs to put in an additional $800 million a year into the pension funds to maintain the legally required goals. So they're basically saying, yeah, guys, we agree with you, but our hands are tied. So now our next step is to get into these models and see what the inputs are, what the assumptions are, and how we can deal with it. Because basically, these are all predictions. These are projections. These are not real, but this is what the state is going with. So interesting problem if you're a finance nerd. And it means a lot to the state of Illinois and the future of its pension funds. So I'll stop sharing and we'll see if there's any more questions.
Yep.
Yes, John.
Yeah, that is interesting what you just said. But then that model then flies in the face of this S&P line where you pulled out the fossil fuels and said it's below the S&P. So somewhere there is a disconnect between that S&P projection over time and what their models have, correct? Because those are two inconsistent positions.
It seems so, but what we picked up from our discussion was that diversification in and of itself is an important metric in the model. And once you change an input that reduces diversification, it has an effect on the expected return on investment, which results in the necessity to increase the shortfall payments by the state.
Mhm.
And that comes out of the state budget.
Yeah,
So
but I say, what's their, what do they have for renewables in that model? Do they have that appropriately accounted for? I'm just thinking aloud as you're going through this.
Right. And there, and we expect to get into that kind of detail because we have to. It means that it's probable, or at least very possible, that we'll be working on this bill into the next session. We won't get it out of committee, perhaps even, and on the floor this session. But the meeting was very good. It opened our eyes to what we're up against, and we haven't previously been able to even talk to the people from the pension fund. So this was a very it was a profitable discussion.
If I may jump in on this question, the graph that I showed was not a model. That's what actually happened historically. And so
Right.
it's not inconsistent. What it does is it shows a place where the future forecasting model is potentially flawed. It's not that the two are inconsistent because one actually happened and one is a
But the
projection.
models have to build on history in some fashion to even get to the future.
Right. So I agree completely with Jeff that probably what's happening is that the way diversification is weighted in the model is probably a mistake. And you can point to this kind of graph as a reason to think that that's so.
Yeah, and we have studies showing that getting out of fossil fuels for pension funds did not hurt the return. And it's the idea that the return on investment would drop a half percentage might not even happen. That's just a prediction that the models make. In reality, it might not happen. But again, I guess there are certain legal requirements that the fund has to satisfy, and they are, in some respects, they're correct when they say their hands are tied. We just have to figure out ways to untie them.
I'd like to ask, I'm in the state of Illinois and I have a very, very, 1 year, made hardly any money, worked at the state university retirement system. So basically, I'm curious, if we live in the Illinois area, what can we do to can you provide addresses or something that we can do to take this cause further?
Yeah, that's
help
a
you
great
out.
question.
Yeah.
Glad you asked. What we're going to do for this and other issues is we're going to try to send out surveys to our roster, to our membership, and try to identify people with their state representative and state senate districts. Okay, so we can match people in our roster with their representatives and have them reach out to them and say, here's a bill that we want you to support. We're your constituents. Okay, what we're doing right now for the divestment effort is we're doing a lot of tabling events, and every time we go out, we bring a stack of blank, well, not blank, but we bring a stack of postcards that say, hey, I live in your district, support this bill. And then we have people put their names and addresses and everything on the postcards, which we keep, and then we hand deliver them to the state representatives and senators. So that's one thing. Look for us at tabling events. But one thing that we do want to do, and I talked to Cynthia about this just recently, is start some of these surveys so we can start to match our member list to the legislative districts where they live. Any other questions?
Yeah, Jeff and Rachel, really great presentation. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask of Jeff, are you aware of certain legislators who are advocates for the fossil fuel industry that are set up to oppose what you're trying to do with the pension funds? Is there a significant opposition in the legislature?
There is opposition, Bruce. We've been focused so much on bringing people on board as co-sponsors and trying to build momentum for that we have kind of purposely stayed away from people that are Republicans, let's say. We've been focusing, we've been looking at the IEC ratings and focusing at the top of that list. And there are a lot of people up there with ratings of 85 or higher that we're looking at. So, we know there's opposition. We have talked to a few Republicans and have been politely shown the door. Yeah, we're under no illusions that there's not going to be opposition. We're just trying to build as much support first before we even attempt to work on those people.
Got it.
Other questions? John?
I know who my rep in center. I've got one who I think is what do you call it? Be able to be persuadable. The other probably would be obstinate, but he's not crazy obstinate. Is there a particular form letter that you would suggest we use, or points to make besides just support the bill? Do you have anything that, I know who mine are. I can write a letter to them, but in terms of how you would want me to present it.
Yeah, John, I can just, what I'll do is I'll just show you the language in our postcards, and that'll be a good way for you to frame your letter to them.
Okay, thank you.
I'll get that to you.
So I think if you can hear me, can you hear me?
Yes, Tom.
I guess my mic's working now. I'm very sorry for the rocky start. I lost our internet connection today. We're on a cell phone here. But anyway, Rachel and Jeff did just a fantastic job tonight. I just want to make sure everybody knows we'll get the slides out ASAP out to you all, so you have a copy of all of these things. And we thank you for your attendance tonight. We're pretty much at the end of our time. Is there a last minute question?
I'll just say thanks, Tom. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody who was here.
Yeah,
that's
thanks
a lot.
all.
Okay, take care.
Take care.
Good night.